Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Fireside Chat. I'm Pallavi Ade. I am the co-founder of Asian Pathfinders along with Suhasini. Today we have Suhasini Haidar joining us for yet another edition of our weekly Fireside Chats. Today's topic is information warfare and Indian foreign policy. Before I hand it over to our moderator Mohit for the proceeding, just a bit about us and the housekeeping rules. So we were started earlier this year with the whole aim of being a knowledge sharing platform where we bring scholars, practitioners, and academicians together to have constructive dialogues on very variety of topics actually. And we're really proud to say that we've managed to do that. We've had just in the last 2 weeks, we have discussions on radical and liberal age to artificial intelligence to India's foreign policy. And next week we have onto very different topics. So do keep an eye out on our social media pages to know more about our upcoming events. So we do this through two sessions. One is our fireside chats, which we are holding today and every Saturday at 11 a.m. Usually it's 11 a.m., but as you will see, our next session is at 10 a.m. because of some reason. And we also hold a series called Dialogues, which are a panel discussion where we bring experts together to discuss various topics. And this is held every alternate Thursdays at 5:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So just a bit of community guidelines before we proceed. We want you to respect the views of others. Do not use defamatory languages, but please do put your questions and comments in the chat section. And Mohit will take them after Suhasini's opening remarks. And again, just respect intellectual property. And upcoming sessions, my colleagues will put the link in the chat section to register for it, but just the sessions are corporate security, the post-COVID world, which is a panel discussion, as I said, next Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And then we have Michael Kugelman, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, Washington, D.C. And he'll be speaking on decoding the political communication in the AFPAC region. Just to notice that Michael's section will be at 10 a.m. instead of our usual 11 a.m. Because of time zone differences. Michael is based in Washington, D.C., and it will be pretty late for him if we do the 11 a.m. session. So please take a note of this change in timing. And about us, this how do you get in touch with us? Shreyas and I are active on social media. You can find us there. Asian Pathfinders is also there. Just look us up. Uh, so before I hand it over to Mohit for the proceeding, let me introduce Mohit Musaddi. I've had the pleasure to know Mohit because of being in the same research community. Mohit is a research associate at Delhi Policy Group, a leading think tank based in Delhi, India. He holds an international relations master's from the War Studies Department of King's College, London, as well as a bachelor's in political science from Kirorimal College. And one of the interesting things is Mohit's dissertation was actually on, excuse me, the differences in the narratives between Al Jazeera English and the Arabic uh, channels of this network. So I think Mohit is the right person to moderate this session. And about Mohit's area of work, it includes India's foreign policy and security and connectivity in India's neighborhood. At the Delhi Policy Group, he has been associated with the BBIN and the BIMSTEC projects, and at present covers developments in Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Nepal for the monthly DPG India Strategic Review. So over to you, Mohit. I think Mohit's going to make his opening remarks and then introduce Suhasini before giving it to her to make her opening remarks.
Thank you, Pallavi. Am I audible?
Yes, okay. You are. Yeah.
Thank you, Shreyas, for inviting me. And I would personally like to welcome everybody for joining us on a Friday morning, and also to Suhasini, who is taking the time out of a very busy schedule to be with us and discuss a very important here. And before introducing her formally, I'll just give you all a very brief intro of the main topic of discussion. When we think of the term information warfare in the current age, we think of social media as an enabler, and to a large extent, it is an accurate perception. We also think of China as being so-called the leaders in information warfare. I mean, we can debate if their propaganda on Twitter and other social media is effective, but nevertheless, it is relentless. And even in the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, they were initially very selective in releasing information, and then to a certain extent, they tried to exercise influence at the WHO to play down the seriousness of the virus. And finally, they began blaming other countries, including the United States and Italy, which is an extensive part of their Belt and Road Initiative. With the coming of the internet age and its decentralized characteristic, the free-flowing exchanges of information is actually limitless, and that in turn has increased possibilities of manipulation and propaganda. Hence, cyber warfare, which is only like a type of information warfare, is becoming, or rather has already become a major risk across the globe. But even as we comprehend these, there are other forms of information warfare as well. And social media is it's an enabler, yes, but it's not the advent. In fact, the concept has significantly evolved over time, from being a wartime propaganda to the spread of fake news during elections and during critical situations. Information warfare has served as an efficacious tactic for the government, as well as for non-state actors. And for countries, it's always been a case of an attempt to shape global information flows by controlling the medium and the infrastructure that enables them. And there are some very sophisticated, age-old, as well as contemporary examples of it. For instance, as Professor Heidi Trauick, she explores in her book that Germany's decades-long push to control world communications really came to the fore in the first half of the 20th century. And they invested heavily in this medium not to achieve technological leadership as one would expect, but to use wireless networks to send news from Germany to as many people around the world as possible. And specifically, we have Qatar's Al Jazeera example, as Pallavi mentioned. I had done my master's thesis there. And there, Al Jazeera's extensive and exclusive coverage of the Arab Spring really put the network on top. And we don't talk about it so much in South Asian policy circles, but I think the Economist referred to the Arab Spring as the Al Jazeera moment. And even in the United States, as Don Levin points out in his book, the U.S. also has interfered in foreign elections at least 63 times between 1945 to 1989. Now, maybe it should be noted that not all interference can warrant as information warfare, but maybe some of them did. And there are other numerous examples. I mean, Rudyard Kipling, I think he defended colonialism as being kind of the white man's burden, and that is also a form of information warfare. And of course, Noam Chomsky, he's extensively looked at the issue of manufacturing concept, and he introduced the concept of propaganda model of communication, where he critically evaluated how information is being deployed in the big corporate sectors. So, I mean, it is not always the government or non-state actors like terrorist organizations, but also these big conglomerates who want to manipulate individuals and determine how how an individual thinks. And but these are all very disparate examples. But the most important question is the desire to propagate an opinion or a view, does that automatically become an information warfare tactic? Or is it more sophisticated than that? I mean, where do we draw the line? Somebody who wants to just articulate their views versus somebody who's seeking to propagate their ideology. I mean, what exactly constitutes information warfare? While from the outside, the concept looks very easy to understand, these are some of the inherent challenges in defining information warfare. I mean, for democracies particularly, they have to be ready all the time to combat information warfare, but at the same time, they have to ensure that the state does not indulge in it on their own citizens. So anyway, these were some of my thoughts, and now without taking much time to discuss all of these and much more, particularly in the context of the Indian foreign policy, I would like to quickly introduce our speaker for today. Although Suhasini needs no formal introduction, it is my duty as a moderator and a real privilege as somebody's work whose work I've come to admire over the years to quickly list out her profile and some of her achievements. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic and foreign affairs editor of The Hindu, one of India's oldest and most read national dailies. Prior to this, she was foreign affairs editor and a primetime anchor for the CNN IBN, where she presented the signature show Worldview with Suhasini Haidar. She's also been correspondent for CNN International's New Delhi bureau before that. In 2015, she was the recipient of one of the most prestigious Indian print journalism award, the Prem Bhatia Award, and she's won other numerous awards for print as well as television. Over the course of a 20-year reporting career, Suhasini has covered the most challenging stories and conflicts from the most diverse regions, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Libya, Lebanon, and Syria. She's also worked with CNN International from 1995 to 2005 and regularly reporting from these countries, from Pakistan and Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. In India, she's covered the foreign affairs beat for over a decade now, and her domestic assignments include political profiles and in-depth reportage from conflict zones, including Kashmir. And her articles at The Hindu cover a wide range of topics, including the Indian foreign policy, international diplomacy, and global security challenges. And so, Asni, I personally want to add that your most recent interview with our External Affairs Minister was quite riveting. Anyways, I'm going to stop speaking now, Suhasini. The floor is all yours for the next 20-25 minutes, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mohit, and thank you, Pallavi, and thank you to the Asian Pathfinders for inviting me to speak. I should thank you not only for inviting me to speak, but for making me stop and pause and actually think about this, because it is a very interesting concept that you have chosen for me to speak about. You know, I've been a journalist, as you pointed out, and you know, no guesses for how old I am, but I've been a journalist for more than 25 years. And much of that has been spent covering Indian foreign policy, which tends to mean flowery language or very opaque statements that are considered really the soul of diplomacy. How do you say something which is accurate, but which also which justifies your own actions and is the best sort of expression of what your foreign policy is? But at the end of the day, when we looked at it, foreign policy was essentially about diplomacy, was essentially about sometimes being defensive. It wasn't considered a part of warfare. And that has changed. So when you ask me to speak about information warfare and Indian foreign policy, there is a link today, which I now look at and I've been thinking about in the last few days, which perhaps was not there before. The reason is because until I think perhaps the Second World War, the idea was that information warfare was part of warfare, i.e. when you say all is fair in love and war, you're essentially saying so long as there is that justification, so long as there is that cover, you can get away with playing with information, if you like. Let's talk about the theory to begin with. Information warfare, what is it supposed to be? It's a targeted effort, and I'm just going by a military definition. Targeted effort to undercut and neutralize the enemy's command and control system for the purpose of protecting and coordinating the activities of the command and control system of yourself or of friendly forces. Obviously, in Indian mythology, and I'm sure everybody's aware of this particular example, there is no bigger example than the Mahabharata, and particularly the death of Dronacharya through information warfare. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, very briefly, at some point in the war, it had gone on for so long, Krishna told Yudhishthir that, look, this war has to be won. Too many people are dying, the war has to be won, and if a lie has to be told in order to win that war, then so be it. What was he referring to? He was referring to Guru Dronacharya's power over been the guru to both the Kauravas and the Pandavas. And his one weakness was, he was a very simple person, but his one weakness was his son, who was called Ashwathama. So essentially, Krishna tells Yudhishthir, it is, you just need to spread the word that Ashwathama has died in the war. Now, originally, Yudhishthir, who's always known as the moralistic, the ethical voice in all of this, says, no, this isn't, my reputation, my morality is not going to permit me to do this, it's dishonest. But as they are both talking, his brother, Bhim, runs out, goes and kills an elephant called Ashwathama, although I'm not sure whether the elephant was already called Ashwathama or he named it Ashwathama before killing it. But he kills the elephant and then shouts very loudly, Ashwathama is dead. And now this is information, and the information begins to spread and word reaches Drona. Dronacharya says, I will not believe it unless Yudhishthir, whom I know to be an honest man, says this to me personally. So he summons him to the enemy camp. Yudhishthir goes there. And Dronacharya says, is it true that Ashwatthama is dead? He doesn't say, is it true my son is dead? To which Yudhishthira replies, technically, honestly, that yes, Ashwatthama is dead. And then says very, very quietly, or as in a whisper, Ashwatthama the elephant. All of this ends, and then Dronacharya, who's so upset, puts down his weapons, bows his head down, and Yudhishthira's brother-in-law comes in and chops off his head. So the act, and I'm describing it in very, very, quickly. The act is of something that is horrible, ethically sounds indefensible. You kill an unarmed person who was your own teacher by subterfuge. But there was the larger good. That was that it helped end the war, that it saved the lives of countless others. And that is what is cited again and again to justify that act. Why am I bringing the entire story up now is because, and Mohit referred to my interview with the External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar. The interview was actually about this book he has written called The India Way. And in it, he has an entire chapter called Krishna's Choice, where he's essentially saying that so much of what happened in the Mahabharata explains how we conduct foreign policy today. And he refers very specifically to information warfare as critical to the mission. He says, in a world that is driven with trade disputes, technology fights, connectivity differences, it may be of some consolation to recall that not playing by the rules, so he's also being very euphemistic about what this is, not playing by the rules has a long history. If some have gained the system of seeking unintended benefits, this is a path that others have trodden before. He also goes on to use Kautilya's phrase, which is Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed, which is alliance, compensation, force, and even trickery. And I will say that's because every foreign policy practitioner, every diplomat, for them, precedent is the most important justification for anything. If it has happened before, we can do it again, more or less. And I think that's what the External Affairs Minister was talking about when he said, why is information warfare all right to be used today as a tool in your warfare? The truth is that this was not always the case. Even until, as I said, the world wars, the world essentially put what they call information warfare, sometimes called psyops, psychological warfare, essentially exclusive to armed conflict. That when there is already an armed conflict going on, you can add information warfare, as Mohit was pointing out, as an adjunct to what you are doing otherwise. You lull the enemy into a false sense that they have won, and then you ambush them, or you use these kind of methods to perhaps throw pamphlets over a population to tell them that their leaders are corrupt, or and these are used in different wars. Of course, the US used it in Vietnam. You ensure that there's so much information coming in that kind of demoralizes the other side. But over time, and I think, it's not just the Mahabharata. Let's remember people like Clausewitz when he wrote about On War, or China's Sun Tzu, who wrote about the art of subversion and the art of war. All of them have essentially been understood and reviewed in a sense to how they pertain to today's day and age, and particularly the age of cyber information. In the modern age, information warfare today includes, and now I'm not talking about an actual armed conflict going on. So it is in the world of diplomacy, it is in the world of Indian foreign policy that it is also used. One of the things is called collecting tactical information. In the old days, of course, this was spying, simple spying. Today, you collect that tactical information by pretending to be somebody else on the internet, honey trapping a soldier, sitting in some other part of India from across the border, through essentially using the internet for this. You have many examples really of how information today is being collected really in a sense, information is being collected by using these, what some would call unethical. Sorry, my audio.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So there's the collection or extraction of tactical information. Sometimes all you have to do is fact check wrong information that has been put out by an enemy. Sometimes you actually spread wrong information, you spread propaganda, you spread disinformation to demoralize or manipulate the opponent. Sometimes you undermine the quality of the information that's coming in. So even if the information is adverse to you, you see, it's actually not that bad. I'm not going to give exact examples, but you'll recognize that. When you lose one particular flank in a conflict, and you say, actually, it's not. This is not the real story. The real story is that I've won this particular mountain, or I have climbed, these heights. To get away from the larger picture, which is that you've given up certain heights as well. And these are used essentially even in diplomatic language and used even by officials. And the last is, of course, you deny the opponent his possibility of collecting information. And you do that by sometimes, guiding media in a certain direction. And every one of us in the media is aware of just how that is done, and particularly in the modern age. You will find WhatsApps that come from certain areas finding themselves being quoted verbatim. And I'm talking not just about India. This happens in so many countries that see themselves in conflict, where WhatsApp will come and the WhatsApp will actually have short phrases and short terms put down so that a television channel can just run them over the ticker. This is all part of information warfare. Eventually you see it get larger. You'll see, for example, in China, when they want to put disinformation, they'll say something about, India weak at the knees and put out videos about soldiers in trouble. In India, we have seen those videos of Chinese soldiers crying in a bus. And we are told, oh, these are Chinese soldiers crying because they have to go and deal with the brave Indian soldiers. Everybody's aware where these videos are coming from, and the fact is that they are being lobbed just like in the old days. You'd lob a grenade or you'd lob a missile or open fire. This is what you're doing. So, what are the broad areas where information warfare is used? There are essentially 6 of them. One is called warfare in the actual command and control area. So information that you are, saying in terms of actual field operation. There is intelligence warfare, which is the exchange, extraction of information that is useful for the enemy. There's electronic warfare, or essentially the use of, I don't want to use the word cyber warfare because that's a little different, but the use of your electronic sphere to put out dissemination. There's, of course, psychological warfare, and some of you would have heard about the idea that that Chinese soldiers were playing Hindi film music that made Indian soldiers nostalgic, or spoke about the 1962 war, and they were blaring these through the night at the LAC in order to do psychological warfare on the soldiers. And I'm sure India has its equivalent as well. Then there is cyber warfare and hacker warfare, where you take over somebody else's website, you take over somebody else's power grid, you take over, you're essentially pushing now where the cyber sphere meets the physical sphere. And that's one more. And the last is economic information warfare. Information that is put out to manipulate a stock market in another country, or to in some way to cause economic losses to that other country. That becomes a kind of warfare. Now, if this had been an open class, I'd ask you all to give me what you think are your examples of where you have seen this kind of warfare. But since it isn't, and I don't want to make this as interactive as possible, I'll give you some more examples, and then you can maybe think about it and then come back to me with some questions. So in 2017, when the Doklam incident happened, a standoff between Indian and Chinese soldiers, at a point on the border. This was a demarcated border. It was Indian soldiers actually had gone to assist Bhutanese soldiers with what looked like a Chinese transgression. And when that began, we suddenly saw the Chinese media erupt with completely wild stories of how India had invaded Bhutan. Then they came into other stories about how the Indian soldiers had behaved. And then little by little, we saw other things coming into the media, including those visuals that you see of tanks being taken to the border. Now, nobody said where those tanks were or which border they were going to. But what does it mean when the Chinese official channels are putting out these pictures that we are preparing for war? One of the other things we saw was essentially military exercises being held. But they wouldn't say military exercises. They just put out these visuals of, I don't know if you remember, even in Ladakh, there was this particular video of Chinese soldiers hopping on a plane in the plains and then flying to some mountain and carrying out a war exercise over there. Now, nobody asked the basic question, what about acclimatization to the heights? What, how are you getting around all this? Because it was a video. It was just put together. They used pictures of this, they used pictures of it, put it together, and put it out really for the Indian public to look at. There was information warfare, and I'm back to Doklam here, not just that came from China, but in the first few days from Pakistan as well. One of the first things we'd heard in Doklam, and although in Doklam, actually speaking, we didn't have any loss of life, there was Twitter accounts that started to announce that 200 soldiers had died in a clash in the Sikkim mountains. And they were then, it was tracked down, and it was tracked down to Pakistani websites. So presumably the ISI had got involved over there. Essentially, this is the nature of information warfare that is used militarily, but it's actually got a diplomatic component to it, because it is now being seen as a country's posture when it comes to dealing with another country. What will be interesting for you to know is, and you must have chosen the subject some time ago, but since Doklam, there has been a huge debate because of what happened there, this kind of consistent warfare from China that essentially gave the impression that they had won the war when they had not. The standoff point continued. Eventually, they disengaged. It's another matter that in the years that followed, China continued its building activity at the Doklam Plateau and all. I'm not getting into that. Talking about the kind of information that they put out there. There was an understanding inside the Indian government that this is something we have to learn from, that we have to deploy, or at least learn how to counter. So just 2 days ago, and this is just an interesting point for you, as part of the larger reorganization of Army headquarters, the government has actually approved the creation of what is called a new Deputy Chief of Strategy, who's at the headquarters, and the creation of a post of Director General Information Warfare, also based at headquarters, who will deal with not just media affairs, but how to deal with this information warfare. So it's very clear that this is a very pertinent issue for the government and an area where the government has felt maybe they hadn't done enough so far. So now we've got a point person. Where else have we seen these examples of information warfare? Not necessarily in terms of conflict even. Turn to our relations with Pakistan. Now, these are particularly interesting because I, as a journalist, am always amazed that you have two countries with a very, very high computer literacy. These are two countries that work quite a lot in the BPO sphere, if you like, in outsourcing as well. Everybody has connections to the internet. Everybody is monitoring news about each other. And yet, every time there is an incident, there are two completely different versions of what happened that go out. One in India, one in Pakistan. And I think we're not even aware of that. We are actually not aware that in Pakistan, the version of every event that we get one version of is the exact opposite it's like mirror images of each other, exactly opposite. I used to see this historically. I'll be honest. There was a Pakistani serial that talked about partition. And what shocked me much more was the Pakistani serial made it seem, this was something with Fawad Khan, made it seem as if all the deaths had occurred on the Pakistani side. That essentially it was Pakistanis who had suffered, Pakistanis who had... And then I began to look at some of our own films and our own portrayal of partition. How many in India would think that anybody on that side died? Essentially, the idea that Indians died. Either the Indians who were coming over from Pakistan or those who were stuck in the violence at the Punjab borders. But there is this complete ability of two countries that have had such hostilities for 70 years to believe the exact opposite. Now, the truth can only be one. The truth is, I would imagine that people on both sides died. Then in the 65 war, there is actually one day that is celebrated in both countries as a day of victory. And again, I said, how is this possible? That there is the Battle of Lahore, and clearly Indian soldiers went in there. Clearly Indian soldiers were able to get as far as they say as the Bata shoe factory there. And yet Pakistan celebrates it as its success. Because for whatever reason, having captured the area, India said this is not as, this was not part of their strategy, and essentially they won the war. So the question is, at what point do you start to cover both sides of the story, or do you never cover them? So this is how we came into the 2016 arena where the Uri attacks happened. India announced that soldiers had gone across the line of control, and all those videos, if you remember, came of a recreated soldiers being parachuted in, terrorist training camps being destroyed, and all the rest of that. Now, those videos were also part of our information warfare because we didn't have original videos, but they were used essentially to portray what had happened. But if you read Pakistani media and you saw what the Pakistani government said, they essentially said nothing happened. Now, you can say the belief, the reason to say nothing happened is because your military assessment is you do not want to go to war. So you use information warfare again to quell the problem amongst your people. In Pulwama, it took on almost comical tones because after Pulwama, there was the Indian strikes on Balakot, and the Pakistani side originally didn't quite understand what had happened. They understood that Indian planes had breached their airspace, that Indian planes had actually bombed a part of Pakistan, which was not even disputed. This was Pakistani territory in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balakot. And the original confirmation, whether it was a mistake or not, it certainly helped the Indian case because India no longer needed to say, we have bombed Pakistan and have Pakistan denied. This time it was from the Pakistani side where the spokesperson of the Pakistani military, the DGISPR, tweeted that Indians had come in. Of course, he said that nobody had died, that nothing, one crow had died or, nothing had been damaged over there. Because there was a certain nervousness, how is India going to use this? And that's how it became. In fact, Prime Minister Modi, in an interview, said that I watched the operation. I was actually quite comfortable that we had taken the revenge we needed to. And I thought I was not actually planning to reveal it at that point. But because the news was confirmed from Pakistan, we then held a cabinet meeting and we decided to put the story out. So again, what you're seeing is a controlling of information, a management of information by both sides, which, history will judge, whether the Pakistanis actually did a self-poll by putting out that information or not. But it's interesting to watch. Very quickly, I'll go through a couple of more examples. Of course, everybody knows about the raging debate between the US and Russia over how much that Russia played a part in changing the way people felt about their election, the election of Trump in particular, and how they put out I mean, I'm not an expert on it, and I know that there are great films out there that you can watch that will tell you exactly how social media has been manipulated by states to influence the outcome in another country. Now, of course, people will say, and Mohit pointed it out, there's the hypocrisy that even before all this information warfare tools were available, America had already intervened in 81 elections between 1945 and I think 2000. So, the means might change, but actually this stuff has been happening. There were also things that I saw in 2011 when it came to the US interventions in Libya. Of course, we already knew that there was in 2003 a completely false sort of story on weapons of mass destruction being found in Iraq. We had also seen completely false stories of how Saddam's officials actually had planned the 9/11 attacks. These were essentially information warfare, not against Saddam Hussein. Those were examples of information warfare against the US population, because essentially what was being created was a justification for the war that was to follow. The war had already been decided, but the Bush administration needed to create a justification, and that's why they used this kind of information, and journalists have now admitted that they were taken up the garden path by this information. There are others where people do not admit that they are giving you a one-sided perspective. In Iraq, for example, and this happened in the first Iraq war, they began the idea of embedded journalism. And embedded journalism essentially means that somebody is sitting in a tank with American soldiers. What happens then is that every attack on the American soldiers becomes an attack on the journalists. And a journalist begins to feel under siege and creates this perspective of the bad guys and us, which then comes through in their writing. Obviously, it is the duty of any editorial team to put the balance into these terms. But I saw this myself, which is why I wanted to share it, and then I'll leave it for a bit. In Lebanon, the Hezbollah had a press team called the Pressbullah, actually is what we used to call it. Within a few hours really of having landed, I made some contact with them and said I'd like to come and see what was happening in 2006 in Lebanon, which was essentially, if you remember, Israelis were bombing parts of Lebanon where they thought their soldiers had been captured, and they had put a blockade out around Lebanon. We were able to get in because India had a special relationship with both Israel and Lebanon. So we were allowed to take a ship in order to extract Indians from this war. So I show up over there, and I'm still a little new to all that's happening. I started being taken on a guided tour. This is where the Israelis bombed us. These are the homes that have been bombed. And you'll see this even now between India and Pakistan. On the Indian side, it's always Indian civilians who have died. Pakistani side, it's always Pakistani civilians who have died. You'll see houses being bombed. But, both sides will not talk about how many others, how many civilians they have killed, in a sense. And I'm not drawing an equivalence here. I'm just saying that we get only one kind of information depending on which government you're speaking. And so they were taking us around to show us the casualties, women and children fleeing from homes that had just been bombed and all the rest. So we go through this little lane, and we hear firing. And we don't know where the firing is coming from. But the next thing we know is Israeli helicopters begin to come in, and they are fitted with guns. And the Israeli gunships, essentially, the helicopters begin to fire down at wherever that sniper fire came. Obviously, all of us, looking at the situation, trying to get video, but also trying to get some shelter. And completely baffled by this sudden war that is conflict has broken out over there. So what happens is, essentially, we were told later that this is how the Pressbullah creates the thing of embedded journalism, because essentially what they're doing is they take you through an area where a sniper then fires up and invites almost counterfire from the other side. In an effort really to align your interests with their interests. So this is, and every side does it. I mean, I'm not trying to point out one or the other. Every side will do it. Now, that is the kind of information warfare that's done on media in order to ensure that my story reflects their point of view. If journalists are aware of what, of this particular thing, then their reportage can be more balanced, and then media organizations can be more balanced in their reportage of it. I'll just end by saying these are really examples that I've given you, but I'm hoping that they will, sort of almost get you to then think about other examples of information warfare that you have directly become used to seeing, whether you're on Twitter, Facebook, or you just get that WhatsApp that says, so-and-so has won, so-and-so has lost. And then you start to think about the narratives that all of us actually across the world are being given.
Thank you, Suhasini. Thank you for a very engaging talk and explaining us how the concept, how the theory of information warfare applies to so many examples, and you gave us very diverse viewpoints as to what actually constitutes information warfare, and it was very fascinating to hear these things. And I won't attempt to summarize your presentation, as I have some questions of my own from your talk, and I'd like to, as a moderator, ask these questions to you. And I'll just start with your last topic of embedded journalism. And actually, we have a question from Shravan, who kind of essentially, you've already answered it. He wanted to ask your views on using embedded journalism in conflict zones as part of the information warfare and also the wider foreign policy of a country. But I just want to also add here, I mean, if now people are more aware of this kind of information warfare, I mean, if journalists are more aware of embedded of these kinds of information warfare, does it make it less effective as a tactic?
The real issue is how it is portrayed by the media organization. I don't blame journalists. Journalists need access. For example, in this particular conflict in Ladakh, no journalist has gone beyond Leh Bazaar. So any story that you are seeing that tells you of exactly what is happening at the line of actual control is not being reported from there. It is based on information from sources at the line of actual control. I mean, at the Hindu, we have had to really go over sources again and again to try and see if you can really go with a certain story. What is the credibility of sources? What is the likelihood of this happening? Especially in a situation where you have zero access, you have zero information, no government is going to speak about what is happening over there, and you have no credible way to deny also what you're getting. If nobody's actually telling you, I'm sorry, this is completely made up, you're just getting it from one source. So you have to keep finding extra sources, and there's a real push to do that. And I'll give you an interesting story, but your question is about embedded journalism. So I think it is necessary to realize the context. Every journalist cannot tell the whole story. And it would be ridiculous of any reader or viewer to expect that they are going to get that whole story. So you must put what you are hearing in context. If I am in Delhi, this is my context, and this is where I'm getting it from. So don't believe necessarily, and I'm not trying to slag media here. I'm just saying, when you see a story, see whether the journalist A puts a name to the story. Is there a byline on that story? Is the journalist willing to stand by that story? B, look for, is it in a credible newspaper, in which case it doesn't matter if there's a byline or not. B, look for whether the journalist tells you where they're getting the story from. There are some times where we have got stories from diplomatic sources. And if I didn't tell you that they were from diplomatic sources, you might think that they are from military sources or government, So the context is very important. There is nothing wrong per se with actually embedding journalists in with militaries. There's really nothing wrong with it, because it's about access. It's about how you're going to see the war for yourself. But the context must be provided first by the journalist, then by the media organization, and then, of course, by the discerning reader. I'll give you that example that I was talking about in this event when the Galwan clash happened, and it was clearly a very fierce clash. Look at the fact that Chinese side has never yet acknowledged deaths on their side. We know for a fact that there were casualties, that there are sorties of helicopters that took out casualties from there. It showed that there were a large number of casualties. Just looking at the injuries and the deaths on the Indian side, you know that there would be a comparable number on the other side as well. Yet they've never put that information out. Holding back that information is also part of information warfare. For posterity, if the Chinese never admit to people having been killed on their side, for posterity, it will look like the Galwan clash ended with 20 Indian soldiers giving their lives and so many more being injured. And that will then make the narrative of the battle very, very different. Remember the Kargil War, where Pakistan would not admit that its soldiers were involved. They said, well, no, there are some locals over there that India is fighting with. They're not fighting with the actual Pakistani army. They were doing that because presumably if they lost, they didn't have to say they were engaged. It took years for them to admit that they were their soldiers and to honor them and to give them awards and all the rest of that. Because I think eventually inside an army, there's a certain ethic and core. But even on our side, one of the things that the Hindu was able to confirm, and this was confirmed by other organizations as well, was that the Chinese side had actually taken some Indian soldiers hostage. Now, this was not something our side wanted a spotlight on, because A, it would hamper their own negotiations with China if it was publicly known, because then the public pressure builds, bring our soldiers back and all the rest. And B, they didn't, the foreign ministry particularly didn't want the information to go out because of the safety of those soldiers in question. So because we could not get fully verified information on whether they had been taken captive, we held the story. Actually, the Reuters agency put out the story on a day. We eventually got our confirmations when the soldiers were returned. So in other words, two things happened at the same time. The confirmation came and we were able to confirm that they were safe as well. We put out the story, but at about 11 o'clock at night, I found that there were messages going around to say even this story must not be put out. Now, every media organization makes their own choices. We did go with the story. Others did not go to the story. And I'd point you to a Caravan magazine article that's just been written about how information is being withheld during this particular clash. Now, because it is an ongoing thing, there are so many things that will not be spoken about right now. But just like the Doklam standoff, where we realize how much was untrue of what the Chinese side was saying, and we could speak about it much later, I'm sure this one will also come up for most people.
Yeah. And coming to your point where you spoke about diplomats feeding news stories, and there's actually a question from Radhika. She asks, what is your opinion on the use of digital platforms and social media by diplomats themselves to assert their country's soft power and effectively use the platform to kind of manage foreign policy and also diplomatic threats to an extent? I mean, we've seen very aggressive use from the Chinese diplomats recently. The Australian example where they put out a fabricated image of an Australian soldier holding a knife to an Afghan child, and then the Australian Prime Minister came out with a press conference and all of that. So, I mean, what is your view on those kinds of information warfare?
And this is just my own personal view. I don't think policy, and I don't think gains that are strategic and long-term in nature can be gleaned by playing mind games over social media. I mean, I genuinely believe that in time people see through, and people have seen through China's wolf warrior diplomacy. They see through this heavy aggression that comes from China's side, and are not reacting well to it in any case. Is it furthering China's objectives? That's the basic question one must ask. If you as a diplomat are actually putting out extremely aggressive or extremely untrue things, essentially, are you furthering the cause of your country and, more importantly, your own duty, which is to be a diplomat? I genuinely don't think so. I also think it leads us into this what they call down the rabbit hole, where you begin to believe, and I see it a lot with politicians as well. So why only slang with diplomats? You begin to believe that this small part of the social media universe is actually the larger universe. So the reactions you get on social media somehow get conflated with this is what public opinion is, and sometimes you can stumble because you're not dealing with the actual policy, you're not dealing with your actual interlocutors, and it is already your own efforts at negotiating or resolving an issue are hampered by the fact that you've already said something on social media. And so I'm not, although I use social media quite a lot as a journalist, essentially it is to put across a story I'm working on or my views about a story I'm following. But I'm under no illusion, if you like, that is the entire universe, that whatever I hear back on social media, and they like my story, it means the story is great, or if they hate it, it means I'm the worst journalist in the world. You have to keep that touch with reality. And similarly, I think governments in particular have to be very careful that they don't conflate what they are seeing on social media or what they are putting out on social media with actual real policy.
Yeah, and slightly moving away from that, I mean, what do you think exactly is the role of established media in combating information warfare? I mean, you spoke about the Iraq example, and they having weapons of mass destruction, the WMDs. It eventually turned out to be false, and like you said, that it was propagated by certain actors, and maybe not anti-Saddam campaigners, but also some people who were against the US population and who wanted the US to get into a war with Iraq. And so, like, what do you think is the role of established media in combating this kind of information warfare? And do you think that even after so many years, are they doing a good job of it?
Well, I think if you're asking about fact checking, essentially, there are now professional fact checkers, and there are great fact checkers who actually come out with every story and say, this video is not true, that video is not true. I think for established media, as you call it, and this is across print, television, and internet, I think for any respectable media organization that takes its professional duties very seriously, it is necessary that that fact check goes into every story. In other words, it is not just enough to say this story was put out, this story is a mistake, and the New York Times has done its bit. If you're watching closely in the last 2 months, there's been a huge fact check within the New York Times on the stories it put out in podcasts over ISIS, where they conducted a series of interviews with someone who said he was an ISIS person in Canada, which turned out to be false. So they do conduct those reviews. But it also, in its own review and in some of the articles that are in the New York Times about it, points out that many of these questions should have been asked before the stories were published or before the podcast was broadcast. And so I think that the fact checking is not an extraneous activity. Fact checking is part of what you do on every single fact. You have to keep pushing the limits. There is no point saying today, and I see this a lot, this is what this, so-and-so said in a speech. Now, I can say technically my job as a journalist is to report what that person said in the speech. But if that speech contains a factually wrong assertion, then it is your duty to put those assertions in context. I'm not saying don't report the comments, but say in actual fact, this is what had happened. We see it a lot, and I'll make too many enemies if I give you too many details of it. But we see it a lot. My point is, and we see it much more in this age, because we are in an age where it's so easy to manipulate facts by just putting one thing out. If I say it, it must be true, kind of thing. But for a journalist, essentially, I have nothing but my credibility. If somebody is giving me the responsibility to go out and cover a story for them, and people are taking a newspaper, watching a television channel, or subscribing to an online portal, they are doing it because they are essentially giving you the responsibility, because you have a certain credibility with them, and they're giving you the responsibility to give them their information. So that responsibility has to be taken very seriously, and it can't be an after the fact, oops, this is a mistake, but it is very important. And you pointed out to the WMD case, it is very important that if you get something wrong, you say so loudly, you accept, and it is possible to move on because mistakes do happen.
Yeah. Okay. Just talking about the Indian government and their efforts to kind of combat information warfare. I mean, not only internally but also through external sources. And there's a question from Anashwara asking whether the government and the armed forces and media can they work in silos, and whether a lack of coordinated strategic communication policy has led to our information warfare not being able to counter the propaganda that has been unleashed on the northern and the western neighbors in recent years.
Well, it can become counterproductive. If, for example, the person putting out information essentially sees this as a one-way street, essentially sees this as, I'm going to give you information, you publish it without questioning it. There will be, it will have an adverse impact on the way a story goes up, because most journalists will turn around and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not true. Can you give me some examples of this? Is this a fact? And all the rest of it. Just 2 days ago, we gave a certain speech at the United Nations, but that speech had certain, errors, and what ends up happening is then the reportage becomes much more. If you remember that very famous case of the Pakistani ambassador putting up a picture of what she claimed was Jammu Kashmir, turned out to be Syria. Nobody spoke about Jammu Kashmir after she did that. Everybody spoke about her lying at the United Nations. Now, if you do that and it gets exposed, you are going to, in fact, hurt your cause of putting out your information warfare more than if you didn't say anything at all. So my advice would be, take journalists seriously, take journalism seriously, and have a relationship in which there is trust on both sides. Unfortunately, in the last few years, there is this idea that any inconvenient fact being reported essentially turns the journalist into an anti-national, or somebody who's not, who does not have India's best interests, or does not have patriotism and all the rest of that. The actual fact is, each of us have a job, each of us have a duty. I live in a democracy. To me, suppressing facts, giving wrong facts is as much, a disservice to the country I live in than it is, to put out facts without checking them. Now, if everybody takes their job that seriously, you will end up with actually not needing to do so much more information warfare. You'll actually be able to get really good information out there and ensure that people understand your point of view.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you make. And just like a follow-up to that, I mean, we can only talk about these things as a democracy where there is, to a very large extent, freedom of information and right to information. But do you also think that we as democracies are more susceptible to information warfare as compared to, say, an authoritarian country?
Are we more susceptible? No. As long as you remain a democracy, there will be a lot of platforms. In fact, I saw Pallavi had a question over there about what happens if you're not a regulated platform. The truth is, in a democracy that is working as a democracy should, there will be a lot of sources of information, but people will be able to judge what is credible and not credible. At the end of the day, an established organization, media organization, pays money to have journalists, to have those journalists travel to the ground, to have those journalists go to the ground and get different points of view, figure out what is the correct story, bring it back to you, take time, take money, take resources over it. The other kind is not going to give you any of that information. And I frankly believe, maybe it's idealistic, I frankly believe eventually the real story prevails. Eventually people will figure out whether something is correct or not. I have no doubt that actually in a democracy, it is easier to find out what is true and what is not. Certainly, I mean, I've covered several dictatorships, and it always amuses me that even if people know they're not being given the correct story, or even if people know that the person they're giving the story to is not correct, nobody actually ever says it. So, I would never undermine the validity of living in a democracy.
That's true. Okay, there's a question from Ashutosh. He's asking. He says that the view in the U.S. right now at the moment is that the Indians and the Chinese are, to quote him, microwaving each other. Is this also a form of psychological ops, as you pointed out, or is it like information war with the media involved? And to what extent is that true, and to what extent is the balance between the military psyops and media included warfare is actually a calculated consideration?
You're absolutely right, and it's something that made me also very curious. I have no idea why credible organizations would have gone with that story without at least getting India's point of view on this. Does microwave warfare actually exist? Can you put chips inside demonetized notes that go and sort of find black money underground kind of thing? To me, any journalist really should have got the Indian Army's point of view. At least put that perspective into your story before you go with a story that says microwave weapons are a problem. I think most media organizations did their fact checks, figured out that this was a fake story, and it has essentially now run out of public domain, and that tends to be what happens. If a story is fake, it sinks like a stone eventually. There may be a lot of hoo-ha over it, but it doesn't prevail, and that's my experience.
Yeah, true. And we have run out of time, but I'll just one more question before I let you go. And it's actually you answered part of the Pallavi's question, but second part was she wants to know what are your views on the future of information warfare in the age of AI and algorithms. So I mean, if we can just conclude with that.
It's very worrying. I'll tell you why. I mean, nowadays we see a lot of memes which essentially show people saying things which are artificially created, what they call deep fakes, but they're used as deep fakes. What happens when you don't get that information? I'll give you a civilian example of this. A few weeks ago, very famous TV anchor Oprah Winfrey conducted an interview with former US President Obama. I don't know how many of you saw it. Essentially, they used CG technology, character generation technology, to make it appear that Obama and Oprah were sitting in the same room. And, they even had, we were talking about a fireside chat today, but they even had a little fireplace that was on both sides, and it really looked like they were looking at each other. Now, Oprah Winfrey did the honest thing. She began by saying, this is not true. He's far away. It's coronavirus time. Neither of us are going to travel. We don't want to put crews at risk. So actually speaking, we are sitting this far away from, I'm in California, he's across America, but we are making it look like it's a real chat. But I am troubled even by the use of that technology, because what you're essentially saying is that you can use the technology, and even if you're telling people straight up, this is not what it seems, subliminally, the message they take away is that these two people are in places that they're not actually. So the future of information warfare is going to use that more and more. They will use the idea of deep fakes, where you have people saying things that they have not said, or that they are in places that they are not at. And it will be that much more difficult for people and for journalists to be able to, these days you hear of so many journalists falling for a meme or falling for something on the internet or quoting something that is not true. It's because we are also trying to keep up with all the new ways in which people are conducting this kind of information warfare. And so, yes, I do worry about the future of where this is going to go. The only thing that I feel is necessary is that we do have to as a world look at artificial intelligence, look at where cyber warfare is going, create global commons. This is going to be no less. It's called the fifth flank of warfare. I think it is going to be the most important one. Whether it is because the other four are for land, sea, water, space, and then you have the cyber warfare. Because a lot of the intent of usage of information warfare, when it is used in a field of strategic, in strategic terms, military terms, is not to just tell the enemy that I have defeated you. It is to goad the enemy into taking the first action. So if in other words, you are able to create the idea that you have done something and force the other side to react in physical terms and then say, but this never happened. You are actually creating an even more dangerous kind of ability to create a war by making the enemy take the aggressive move. I'm not sure all of this is coming across, is completely comprehensible, but we are looking at a very dangerous time. And I think it's necessary if the next generation particularly understands this. Seeing is no longer believing. So you have to now start finding ways that maybe it's necessary for everyone to publish not only the video, but the metadata of the video. Maybe that, the future is going to be everybody needs to be able to read metadata and tell you this is false, this email never went, and all the rest of that. So I do think it needs, and it's an important question that you asked.
Yeah, I think thank you, and I would probably be speaking on behalf of everybody here. Thank you so much for enlightening us with a very important topic and sharing some very important discussions on what is information warfare and how it is being constituted. I would like to hand over now to Pallavi, and I'm just going to mute myself here. Thanks.
Thank you, Mohit, for joining us today as the moderator. I think we've had really wonderful questions, and sorry if we have not been able to address your questions. Lack of time, and it's always wonderful to see your questions and comments. So, like I said, thank you, Mohit, again for joining us, moderating this session. Thank you to all the participants for always being an engaging audience and keeping the discussion going with your questions and comments. And definitely a final thank you to Suhasini for taking the time out from her busy schedule to join us and share her views today on a topic which is going to be a very developing as well as a topic to watch in our digital age. So thank you again, Suhasini, for sharing your views. And before I let you guys go, just announcement, our next week's session with Michael Kugelman next Saturday is going to be at 10 a.m. and not at 11 our usual time. So please take a note of that. And I'll see you next weekend and next Thursday also. And definitely have a good weekend. Stay safe, everyone. Take care.